Excellent. Well, we might get started then. I'd like to welcome you to this special SIAC webinar series, which this month is focusing on economic and social development. I'm Natalie Pearson and I work at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. Here in Sydney, it's a very wild evening, a lot of thunder and lightning. So we are apologising in advance for the noise, but also just wanting to flag that there might be issues with connectivity. And if that is the case, our panelists will continue on without me. I think you can probably hear the thunder in the background right now. So as I said, I'm Natalie Pearson, and I'd like to acknowledge that the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre and the University of Sydney is based on the land of the traditional owners of Australia. And I'd like to recognise the continuing connection to land, water and culture. The Sydney Southeast Asia Centre is on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I myself am zooming in tonight from the lands of the Bidjigal people. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you may be dialing in from tonight, and pay my respects to their elders past and present as well. So tonight we are joined by my colleague, Associate Professor Tiho Ancev from the School of Economics at the University of Sydney. Tiho is also the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre's country coordinator for Vietnam, and we are very grateful for his ongoing input and contribution to the work of our centre. He's joined tonight by Ms Chi Nguyen, who is a research student here at the University of Sydney, and she's also a former field school student. We went to Vietnam to look at urbanisation in Hanoi in January 2019. So a special welcome back to you, Chi. It's wonderful to see you continuing to contribute to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre.
Thank you.
So Tiho and Chi are going to speak to us tonight on the topic of strategic planning in agriculture, insights from Southeast Asia. And they're going to speak to us for about 40 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A. So if you do have questions coming up while they're presenting, feel free to pop them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tiho. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks everyone for joining. So it's a pleasure to present in this SIAC seminar series. And it's a pleasure to talk about this work that I did together with Chi and Gordon and other colleagues from Vietnam and from Australia. So it is about strategic planning in agriculture. As a matter of background, I'll just say that this work was done under an ACIAR funded project, and the aim of the project was to help Vietnam with their strategic planning for agriculture for the period 2021 to 2030. There will be a final report shortly available on the ACIAR website, so for those interested, feel free to have a look at it once it is available. If you can't wait, let me know and I'll send you a copy of that report even straight away, so feel free to do that. Now, that report is rather long and broad. Tonight, we are focusing here on the review of strategic plans for agriculture that we conducted for several Southeast Asian countries for the purposes of this project. We also conducted a review of some strategic plans for agriculture for developed countries, states in Australia, US, and Canada. So I'll be focusing really on that. But before I do that, so that comes sort of in the second part of the talk. In the first part, I'll provide some discussion on strategic planning in general and strategic planning in agriculture in particular. So there's the plan, give you a bit of a sense about strategic planning in agriculture, strategic planning in general, and then talk about, well, how have Southeast Asian countries done strategic planning in agriculture, and what to suggest for the future strategic plans. Okay, now before I do all that, I just want to sort of motivate this talk by asking the question, well, why do we even need strategic planning in agriculture? why is it important to have that done? And to sort of think about it, I provide here some data from the World Bank, which is the percentage contribution of agriculture to the value added of the GDP. So effectively, what is the proportion of the economy that can be attributed to agriculture? Now, I mentioned Australia, Canada, and America, and here they are with about 2% for Australia and Canada and about 1% for America as a percentage of GDP contributed by agriculture, and yet they have strategic plans for agriculture. Many of their states do. So you know, in that context, there is no question that Southeast Asian countries should actually think strategically about their agriculture, because agriculture is still very, very, very significant in these countries. As you can see here, the percentage contribution to GDP by agriculture ranges from about 9% in Thailand to over 16% in Laos and other countries in the middle. I mean, I'm just talking about selection here of Southeast Asian countries. We haven't covered all of them, but these 5 we covered, and they're a significant part of Southeast Asia. We also looked at, well, I also looked here at the numbers for East Asia, Japan, Korea, are very, very small compared to Southeast Asia, and even China is much smaller. So the point is, agriculture is very important in Southeast Asia and continues to be so. And strategic planning in agriculture, therefore, is a justified exercise that this governments should be doing. So, what is strategic planning in general, and strategic planning in agriculture? You know, how do we think of that? How do we define it? Well, you might say that it's a collection of sort of deliberative decision and actions that are designed to shape and guide the sector over the planning horizon, or a system of thinking strategically about the future, where the decision makers can anticipate and prepare for uncertain events. So think here in the context of agriculture, droughts happen, you know, very often. We are uncertain when they're going to happen, but we know they're going to happen, and so we can anticipate and prepare. Bushfires, floods, things like that. But you know, thinking about COVID-19, one can say, well, this was not really unforeseeable. However, we argue that in the context of strategic planning, it's probably worthwhile thinking about anticipating and preparing for this type of unforeseeable events by sort of proactively exploring what the threats might be, where can they come, kind of playing out some various types of scenarios. What if COVID-19 happens, or what if some other type of disaster or disruption happens? Even though they could be very unlikely, the cost that we all incurred through the COVID-19 pandemic justifies this type of approach. So is that type of system to think about this type of future events and how we might respond to them. And probably most broadly is forming an image, a sort of imagination of how a sector of an economy, in this particular case, agricultural sector, should look like at the end of the planning horizon. It might be 5 or 10 years' time, and then put in place a set of specific plans and actions to achieve that image. Okay, so we imagine how we want to look like, and then we think about, well, you know, what we need to do to achieve that image. So that's really strategic planning in agriculture. And if you look through the literature on strategic planning, it's a lot of it in management science and so on. You'll find a fairly consistent structure of strategic plans, what they consist of, and what are their components. So typically we start with some sort of a purpose. Why do we need strategic planning? What do we want to achieve? And what is the planning horizon? What is the sort of the date by which we want to achieve this? Then we sort of determine the status quo. What is the current state? What is the future likely to be influenced by? What are the things that are going to shape the next 10 years in agriculture, and in agriculture in Southeast Asia in general? So we need to think about these overarching trends that are going to shape the future. And that helps us then having the current state and trends that helps us then articulate a vision of this image that we want to see for the sector to be in, let's say, 10 years' time. So what is that vision for agriculture in the future? How do we want agriculture to look like? And then, consistent with that vision, we need to put in some specific objectives or goals, and then think about strategies or actions that we are going to take to achieve those goals. Okay. After we've done all this, the hard bit comes, which is, well, now we have to actually implement these actions, strategies. We now actually have to do this in order to get to that image. And as we go along, as I would argue, and especially towards the end, we need to make some evaluation and say, well, are the strategies working? Are we starting to see that image emerging over time? And are we likely to reach that image? Or at the end of the planning horizon, can we say that we've actually done what we set out to do? Okay, so this is the kind of the structure of the strategic plan that is typically used in planning exercises. So I'll start with vision and then move to goal, strategies, and implementation and evaluation. I will not dwell too much on purpose and current state, because this will be very specific to very specific countries. So here's a vision, and I give here the example for Vietnam that we've prepared for the project that I talked about. And so typically the vision should be encapsulated in a very short, punchy sentence. And we have here that type of sentence saying, we envision agriculture in Vietnam in 2030 to be smart, safe, sustainable, and resilient. Okay? Smart, safe, sustainable, and resilient agriculture for Vietnam. And then we specify in about 10 dot points, what do we actually mean by this sentence? What are the smart aspects? And I've color-coded them here for you. Maybe you can see. So smart means use new technologies, develop business innovation, entrepreneurship, create a trusted brand product of Vietnam. Sustainable means be environmentally friendly, be sustainable. And resilient means be resilient to the effects of climate change, diseases, supply chain disruptions, and enhance social and cultural structure in rural Vietnam. Okay? So this is the vision. That's what we want to see for agriculture in Vietnam to look like in 10 years' time. Then we specify the strategic goals. Now, what are the goals? Well, the goals are simply what is it that we want to be achieved. Okay? So you can think about objectives or targets or aims. Now, typically what you see in the past and even today in strategic plans in agriculture in particular is that you have production targets. So a strategic plan might say something like, we are going to have X million tons of rice per year produced by 2030. Maybe, I don't know, 100 million tons of rice, I don't know. Right? Or worse, they might say, we are going to have 1 million hectares under rice by 2030. Now, we argue in the report, and I argue here, that these are not particularly useful targets to have for a variety of reasons, but key reasons are that they're very normative and prescriptive, and they do not take into account possible changes in demand. But people might actually reduce their demand for rice in Southeast Asia, and that's something that we already start to see. The demand for rice, which is still considered a super staple in Asia in general, in Southeast Asia in particular, is actually dwindling. People shift, incomes are increasing, and people shift to more nutritious foods, hopefully more healthy foods, and away from rice. And so preferences change, prices change, global supplies change, and so on. So these type of targets, we argue, should be avoided. There are value types of targets where, for instance, we might see something like we are going to export X million of US dollars of aquaculture products, for example, by 2030. They are a bit better than production targets because they do take at least the price as an economic factor and somewhat of the demand, but they're still limited in the sense that they're still very prescriptive and they are sort of very normative. So let's say that the international demand for aquaculture increases, and this type of target might be, easily achieved. The industry might say, well, it's a strategy that we only need to export this much, and they might slow down their efforts to increase the export. So that sort of leads me to the general discussion on numerical targets versus descriptive targets. Obviously, numerical targets are meaningful because they are quantifiable and measurable. Right? So, for instance, we might think about a strategic target of increasing average years of schooling in rural areas by a given percentage. Right? So this is a good target to have, but what is that percentage is very hard to actually determine. What is the right number to use here? And so what we recommend perhaps is that might be useful to use bands and say increase between X and Y% in average years of schooling in rural areas. Or you can have descriptive targets. Unfortunately, they can be non-committal. So for instance, one can say, oh, our strategic objective is to improve health status among rural population. But that's really doesn't tell us much. What does it mean to improve health status? You need some sort of measuring, some sort of quantification here. But there are instances when descriptive targets are justified. So for instance, for Vietnam, we envision creating a trusted product of Vietnam brand. And that's not necessarily directly measurable. It could be measured perhaps later on, but it is justified in this case, even though it's a descriptive target. So we have the targets, then we have to think about the strategies that will allow us to meet those targets. Okay, so what is a strategy? Well, it's a plan that will integrate the targets, the policies and actions together. And in short, strategies is really telling us what to do to attain the strategic goals. And so in practice, what they comprise of are policies, programs, regulations, incentives, action plans, things that governments, organizations, or non-government organizations can do to actually attain the strategic goals. So in designing strategies, we need to very carefully consider what are the policy tools available, what are the things what are the levers, what are the things that we can actually adjust by policy or by regulation. proper resourcing of these levers. In other words, we might have great ideas, but we might be constrained by resources and not be able to do the strategies that we would like to do. So we have to explicitly acknowledge the constraint of resources. What are the administrative processes, and what are the potential behavioral responses of the affected agents? So how will the agents respond to particular policies? We want an optimal strategy mix that will be achieving the goals within the specified time frame, i.e. being effective, achieving the goals at the lowest cost for society, and be equitable in a sense that the distribution of costs and benefits within society is going to be fair. Okay, and then comes the hard part, implementation and evaluation. So implementing those strategies and evaluating the outcomes of the strategic planning exercise. And this is difficult because it's kind of easier to formulate strategy because it's kind of a creative process, blue sky thinking process undertaken by leaders. But then when it comes to implementation, we have a very practical, lengthy, potentially arduous, laborious endeavor that will require efforts from everyone. Okay? And so this is where strategic planning fails in terms of implementation of strategies. In the literature, there is a documented 50 to 80% fail rate because of this lack of implementation. And for a variety of reasons, but mostly leaders are happy to think about strategies, but a bit reluctant to get their hands dirty and actually do the implementation. And it's often not clear who is responsible for what and who is accountable for what. Okay? So there's the implementation, and at the same time, we need to think about evaluation and monitoring. Typically, that's not being done on an ongoing basis. Typically, in the past, what has happened is, well, we put in a strategy that goes from 2021 to 2030, and then we forget about it. We come in 2029, we're going to produce a new strategy in 2030, and that's when we're going to start thinking, well, what have we achieved with the previous strategy? But as time goes by, this strategy to performance gap is likely to widen, and identifying that gap earlier rather than later will allow to make some interventions in the meantime and actually perhaps adjust some of the strategies and get ourselves much better chance to achieve the goals that we set out to achieve. So monitoring and evaluation needs to be done as we go along. Perhaps every year, a couple of years, there has to be some sort of follow-up about, well, how are the strategies working? Are we moving towards the goals? Or are we not seeing much progress? And if so, what can we do to alter that? Okay, so that sort of finishes my kind of introduction to strategic planning and strategic planning in agriculture. And I would like to now move to the review of strategic plans that we undertook for the Southeast Asian countries and the three developed countries, and to then draw some sort of parallels and contrasts, and then to draw some lessons for Southeast Asia in terms of strategic planning. So we reviewed strategic plans for Indonesia, Thailand, Laos, the Philippines, and obviously for Vietnam. But I'll present, what we propose for the most recent strategic plan for Vietnam. But let me start with Indonesia here, and I'll just cover the very key points. These are typically very lengthy documents, and it's hard to sort of distill them in one slide, but I'll just sort of cover the key points. And for Indonesia, if you look at that plan, it's really all about food security, farmer welfare, and poverty alleviation. I have poverty alleviation here in bold because it's something that I want to draw attention to, because, and this will come in other plans as well, but it's questionable in my mind whether agricultural strategy is the same thing as the poverty alleviation strategy. I would argue that poverty alleviation is a much broader social problem than just agriculture. It's not only about production and distribution of food, it's much more than that. And sort of hoping to address poverty alleviation simply through packaging it in agricultural strategy is not necessarily the best way to have a poverty alleviation strategy, or indeed to have an agricultural strategy. Okay, so Indonesia, they focus on that. They also focus on development of human resources, which is kind of a common theme. I'll come to that. Building entrepreneurship skills in agriculture, which is also quite good. They talk about the need to increase value added in agriculture, which is also very desirable. And on the environmental side, they talk about low carbon development. This is quite interesting. Most countries have more broader statements about environment, but Indonesia talks about low carbon development. And obviously, they talk about adaptation to climate change, as adaptation is really one of the main problems facing agriculture in Southeast Asia. Then we looked at Thai's agricultural strategy. Interestingly, something that sort of caught my eye is that they talk about the role of agriculture in national security. And national security was also mentioned in Indonesia's plan. I was just scratching my head and thinking, well, is national security really something that one should be talking about in an agricultural strategy plan? That doesn't seem right to me, but that's what it is. Thailand's plan talks about improving competitiveness in domestic international markets, and this is kind of also a recurring theme because agricultural producers are increasingly under pressure, both in domestic and international markets, from global competition in food supply. And so the Southeast Asian agricultural sectors do need to increase their competitiveness, both in domestic and international markets. And so that's a good point being raised in the Thailand's strategy. They talk about environmentally friendly development, the green growth for sustainable development. They also mention organic agriculture. This is also found in Laos strategic plan, but not in many others that I've seen. They acknowledge the effects of climate change in agriculture, but they're not really elaborating too much on it. They mention food security. They also mention specifically smart farming. They talk about agriculture 4.0, which is a widely used term in Southeast Asia. I find a lot of people talk about agriculture 4.0 without quite perhaps envisaging exactly what it means, but I suppose is the digital agriculture revolution, even though Southeast Asia is not quite at the forefront of that revolution, but there are aspirations in that regard, which I think is probably reasonable. Then also something that comes through many plans is the strengthening of supply chains and improving product quality. Thailand also has specific commodity-based strategies. So rice strategy, rubber strategy, oil palm strategy, which is quite interesting. No other country has this type of sub-sectoral strategies. And in fact, in my mind, strategic plan is much higher level, and it should be sort of not getting into the specificities of individual subsectors. They also talk about land and farm consolidation, and this is something that is of big interest to Southeast Asia. There is considerable land fragmentation, and that actually sort of impedes the wider penetration of agricultural technologies, especially of smart and digital technologies, robotics, drones, things like that. So thinking about farm consolidation is certainly something that is worthwhile in the context of strategic planning. Looking at the Philippines, again, we have very strong focus on poverty alleviation, food security. They talk about also competitiveness. Now, the rate of commercialization is something that comes in the Philippines and in the Laotian strategy. Obviously, this is very important. Unfortunately, in Southeast Asia, we still have significant subsistence agriculture where the main objective of the farmers is to produce food for themselves and for their families, and not for market. And that's something that probably needs to change. And it has changed. For instance, I know in Vietnam, that's less and less prominent. Most of the farms are commercial in the sense that they produce for the market. And that's really the way of lifting agriculture up and increasing the value. The Philippines strategic plan also talks about increase in public investment in physical infrastructure, rural credit, as well as in human capital in rural and agriculture areas, which also is very important, and I'll touch upon that a bit later. For Laos, it's quite unique in several aspects. First, is the only plan that we've seen that actually identifies and talks about gender issues in agriculture, which is quite refreshing, very important to actually notice this and to talk about it in the context of strategic planning. And also, it's kind of specific about providing safe food for the nation. So food safety is highlighted rather than, in most other plans they talk about food security. In Laos, they also talk about improving commercialization of production, reducing natural, so reducing pressures on natural capital and natural resources, and promoting green growth in organic farming. They mention human resource development, infrastructure development. They have something which I find a bit odd, which is called zoning planning. So they sort of specify which enterprises to grow in which zones. Again, I don't think that's the job of the strategic plan to do. Also, on the more critical side, they have a non-focused vision statement. I've got it here. It's very hard to read and comprehend. It's not short, not punchy. And they're extremely heavy on numerical targets. There are numbers upon numbers and tables upon tables in this plan. And that becomes very unuseful, not very useful, sorry, because it's very hard to comprehend what all these numbers mean. So it's an example of probably over reliance on numerical targets. For Vietnam, here are some of the things that we sort of recommend for the new strategic plan. And this is obviously only a snapshot of those recommendations. We've got many more in the report, but this we thought are probably the main ones. So the key for Vietnamese agriculture is to further improve the productivity. And you can do that either through improved use of technology, which is certainly something that should be aspired to. But we think that more importantly, we need to improve human capital in the rural areas and human capital on farms in Vietnam. And this is, I think, true for all Southeast Asia and in general for all farming and agriculture. Really, I think the key to success is getting more capable, better educated, smarter, savvier farmers. And if we can do that, then the farming sector, the agriculture, will have the best chance to succeed. But to do that, you really need to make or rural areas and agriculture a desirable occupation, and rural areas a desirable place to live. Right now in Southeast Asia, I don't think that rural areas are seen as desirable places to be. There is still very high migration to urban areas from rural areas. This causes further problems in urban areas. And what we were suggesting is that, strategically, a government should think about, well, how do we make rural areas better places, and how do we make them more attractive for people to live, contribute, invest in, and so on. And that includes a whole host of issues, including education, health, infrastructure, as well as sort of improving the conditions for girls and women in rural areas, because unfortunately, especially in Southeast Asia, we still have a situation where girls and women in rural areas are not acknowledged and not given a lot of opportunities, and therefore they look to get out of those rural areas, perhaps going in some of the urban areas. Unless this gender sort of issue is resolved, it will be very hard to make rural areas a better place to live in. The other thing that we thought about is food security. Obviously, this is a big issue in Vietnam and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. But what we suggest is to broaden the notion of food security to include sort of safe, wholesome, and nutritional food in the sort of line of the One Health initiative. So to think about not only food that will make people not going hungry, but also food that is healthy, promotes longevity, promotes healthy lifestyles, keeps people out of hospitals and things like that. So we think here about, rather than food security, maybe we need to think something about nutritional security. For Vietnam, improving food safety is really important. And that sort of goes from improvements in value chains to actually a prerequisite for building a brand products of Vietnam, because without having very strong food safety record, it's very hard to build a brand. And finally, environmental challenges are large in Vietnam, especially adaptation to climate change, which is already evident in Vietnam. Farmers are already feeling quite strongly the changes in climate, and adaptation should be front and center of any sort of agricultural strategy, but also reduction of negative environmental effects from agriculture and reduction of environmental and natural resource pressures imposed by other sectors in agriculture. So, for instance, a big problem in Vietnam is sand mining from riverbeds that causes land subsidence, causes changes in the flood patterns and things like that, affecting agriculture significantly. So that kind of concludes the review of the 5 Southeast Asian countries. I'll briefly go, very briefly, over the reviews in developed countries. So in Australia, there are state-based strategic plans, and we looked at South Australia, Queensland, and Victoria. Interestingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, animal welfare is a common and distinguishing feature of the Australian strategic plans. We do care about live exports and animal welfare in general, and that's something that features prominently. But other than that, some plans have numerical targets, others do not. Some plans talk about food culture, which I thought is quite interesting, in contrast to food security. So here, when we talk about food culture, we think about wining and dining and creating food-related and agricultural-related experiences. And that's probably something that Southeast Asian countries could learn from and think about in the future. They also talk about human capital for agricultural development, much like other plans, and talk about supply chains and talk about environmental stewardship. In Canada, we looked at Ontario's strategic plan. They are big on branding and marketing for international markets, so export-oriented, as well as thinking about diversifying the portfolio of agricultural products that they produce in Ontario. They also mention these healthy aspects of producing food for consumers, and they talk about lowering the agricultural carbon footprint. In the US, we looked at Indiana's strategic plan, and this is really an example of a strategic plan that is most in line with the scholarly approach. If you remember that sort of structure of strategic plan that I talked about, this is a plan that is best aligned, follows that structure very, very nicely, and it also identifies stakeholders. So it's kind of a blueprint of how a strategic plan should be done. The focus, though, is, I mean, apart from talking about some of the same things as the strategic plans in Australia and Canada, here the focus is on the global role for the Indian agriculture sector. They're sort of outward-looking, export-oriented, and technological leaders and things like that. Okay, what are the commonalities and divergences between findings in developed versus developing countries? Well, there are some common themes across all jurisdictions. So all the plans that we looked at talk about building and improving human capital in agriculture. So that's clearly something that is very, very important and needs to be pursued in strategic planning. Many talk about further developing agricultural supply chains, improved environmental stewardship, as well as the need for investment in infrastructure in agriculture in rural areas. What are the differences? Well, on 4 points here, I know differences. So, for instance, there is notable difference in terms of approach to technology. In developed jurisdictions, there is very clear articulation of the approach towards high-tech digital agricultural technologies. Whereas in developing jurisdictions, there is a bit of a talk on those technologies, but really the mentality is still well within the more conventional technology adoption, i.e. through extension, and so sort of teaching farmers how to do certain things. It's not quite consistent with the high-tech digital agriculture because you really need very not highly educated, but highly trained farmers to take advantage of this type of technologies. And obviously, that's lacking in Southeast Asia, and also the structure of agriculture is not as conducive to this high-tech agricultural technologies. On the environmental side, in developed jurisdictions, there is more emphasis on reducing the carbon footprint from agriculture, whereas in developing jurisdictions, we see greater aspiration to green growth of agricultural development, as well as adaptation to climate change, which again is not surprising, as the Southeast Asian countries really need to be quickly jumping on adaptation to climate change. In terms of food security, food culture, so in developed jurisdictions, there is this talk of food culture, whereas in developing, we talk about food security and poverty alleviation. And in terms of type of strategic goals, there is much greater emphasis on numerical strategic targets in developing jurisdictions in Southeast Asia and in developed jurisdictions where we have many more descriptive sort of targets, aspirations, and things like that. So that leads me to my last couple of slides, and I'll finish, and then we can talk about some of the questions. I see some questions coming in already, but please put in some more questions. But before we do that, I want to sort of draw some inferences, draw some conclusions, well, not conclusions, but really pathways for the way forward for strategic planning for agriculture in Southeast Asia. And so, in my mind, the strategic plans in Southeast Asia in agriculture should be structured, following more or less the structure that is widely accepted in the literature, and it's just a useful structure to articulate what we want to achieve with strategic planning. And the key point within that structure is to have that vision, that image of where we want to see agriculture in 10 years' time. This vision should be clear, it should be ambitious, but should also be realistic and achievable. Okay? And to attain that vision, we need to also put in aspiring but achievable targets, something that is realistic, something that can be achieved, but it is aspiring, that sort of raises the bar, but raises the bar just at the right level. Clearly, there is no brainer in my mind that emphasis on human capital in rural areas is key. We need to improve education in rural areas, education of farmers, but also other things such as improve health conditions, improve life expectancies, reduce morbidity, reduce mortality in rural areas. This is fundamental to agricultural development. Parallel to that, there needs to be improvement in infrastructure, both physical and social infrastructure in rural areas. Also, the 2 points that I really sort of want to stress is that agricultural strategy is not necessarily a poverty alleviation strategy. As I mentioned earlier, poverty alleviation is a broader problem than just agriculture. And I would think that it should be addressed separately. Now, I realize that a lot of farmers in Southeast Asia and in other countries are poor, but it doesn't mean that agricultural strategy will leave them out of poverty necessarily. There might be other types of strategies that will help them. Certainly, agricultural strategy may play a role, but it's not something that should completely coincide with the poverty alleviation strategy. And nor is a food security strategy. If we talk about agricultural strategy, is not really a food security strategy. In other words, we're not going to solve the problem of people being hungry or people being malnourished or undernourished by agricultural strategy necessarily. We again need a food security strategy, or maybe nutritional strategy. But equally, I think in some Southeast Asian countries there is overemphasis on food security, given the fact that food security is quite good in some Southeast Asian countries. So, for instance, in Vietnam and in Thailand, there is an index of food security produced, global index of countries, and Vietnam is up there with some countries, members of the European Union. So, if that's the index of food security in Vietnam, I don't think there is a really big problem with security, and there needs to be some sort of rethink about it. And I think the rethink should be towards the promotion of healthy, safe, and nutritious food. That's really where things will be going in the future. That we need to support healthy people. We need to reduce obesity, reduce undernutrition, provide nutritious food, and so on. So, as a matter of conclusion, I'll kind of summarize very quickly. I think we're going to see strategic planning in agriculture in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years maybe. So it's here to stay. Governments should move to a more scholarly approach, structured approach, as opposed to something that you could call more of an ad hoc approach that was prominent in the past. There is literature out there, and there is clear structure that we can follow. The focus should move from production area targets to more holistic targets for the rural areas, making basically the rural areas better places to live in. Food safety and health aspects should be promoted. This is increasingly important and sort of interlinked with so many other aspects of the food sector, including supply chains, including markets, including branding, things like that. Environment, natural resources, and climate change are really the key factors to consider, especially in Southeast Asia. And finally, if COVID-19 teaches us anything, is that we shouldn't just sit and wait for COVID-19 or for some other difficulty to come in or some other disruption. We should be be proactive in identifying and preparing for even these unforeseeable threats. And it's hard, but in the report we talk about some ideas as to how this might be done in the future. So with this, I will stop. I probably went a little over time, so thank you for your patience. There are questions I can see, and I'll let Natalie take over, and maybe she can help me also with some of the questions.
Thank you, Tiho. That was fantastic, and it's great to see these questions coming through. I will jump straight into the questions, and in fact, Daniel Tan has asked a question that I also wanted to pose to you, which is in regards to national security. And whether agriculture shouldn't be considered part of a national security plan. Daniel says, I wouldn't feel very nationally secure if I were living in a country with food insecurity. So could you comment on that, the relationship between agriculture and national security? Because you did say that you didn't think it had a place in a national security plan.
Yeah, sure. Look, wouldn't food secure, nationally secure? Well, if you're food insecure, you are not secure, period. Right? You're not secure in every aspect of your life. And so, you know, when thinking about national security, what comes to my mind is something like military, something like, you know, foreign interference, things like that. I still don't believe that that's an issue, and that agriculture strategy should be instrumental in sort of thinking about national security strategy. So that's really my view. I think food insecurity, I agree, it's a very insecure position to be in, but not necessarily just from nation security aspect. From any aspect of a human being is a very, very insecure position to be in. And so, therefore, I feel putting in national security sort of probably has a bit more political connotation context, and kind of saying, oh, well, you know, we need to work on agriculture because it's our national security. Well, yeah, but I think we, you know, I don't think there's the best argument to put in.
Okay. Right.
Yes, thank you. I would like to add to that.
Sure.
Sure. So I think when you trying to put food security together with national security, there's many layers you need to peel away from. So, for example, you know, when you talk about agricultural strategy, are we talking about agricultural productions or food security or nutritional security? A lot of countries in the world, you know, they are considered food secure, even though they don't have a large agricultural sector. For example, Singapore, I don't imagine they have a very large agricultural sector or an active one. Yet, you know, they are not food insecure because they trade in agricultural products. You know, very high income country. You know, they can afford to import lots of food, for example, things like that. On the other hand, you know, Southeast Asian countries, very large agricultural production base, but then you know, not very high income and very vulnerable to climate change and that sort of thing. The impact of external factors on production, or for example, if you look at another ways between food security and nutritional security. So the United States, for example, you know, very large agricultural nations, you know, very powerful, but overall, I wouldn't say that American people are actually nutritional secured. If you look at the instances of obesity, malnutrition, and a lot of processed food, that sort of thing. So I think that's what you need to peel away from, rather than just looking at, oh, is it just enough food to eat, or just what is the role of food in that?
We lost you slightly at the end there, Chi, but I think we got the essence of what you were saying. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on because we do have a few more questions. Ruth Zadox has a question on the scope of agricultural policies and whether they generally address crop production and production of food of animal origin, including aquaculture, to the same extent.
Yeah, good question, Ruth. It's interesting. I mean, if you look at in Australia, Canada, certainly in the Australian plains, you see much greater presence of animal agriculture. In Southeast Asia, I suppose, animal agriculture hasn't been as prominent as, let's say, it is in Australia. Obviously, aquaculture is, and especially Vietnam, Thailand, I think that's clearly acknowledged, and there are strategic plans specifically for aquaculture and specific targets for aquaculture. But yeah, you don't see too much on, on animal agriculture more generally. Really, the focus is on crops. As I showed for Thailand, there was plantation, specifically for plantation crop strategies, for rubber and I don't know the other one, but I think aquaculture is now really, getting into the strategic plans.
Okay, Chi, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Okay, great. Okay, a really interesting question. I'm going to go to Veronica Gregorio's question here. She thanks you for your presentation. And the question is, in terms of improving human capital in rural Southeast Asia, do agricultural policies consider how migrant workers return to their farms after retirement and promote farm life among young people?
Yeah. Very good question, I think. I presume here migrant worker means someone from the rural area that went to the urban area, worked there for maybe 20, 30 years, then retires, goes back to the rural area. I haven't seen any mention of this, but I think it's really important, and it's good. It's a very good point. I think we can, those people could have a big role, especially as investment role. Thinking about investing their pension savings or things like that back in the rural areas. That would be something that should be encouraged and should be welcomed. But I haven't seen any active thinking around this in Vietnam or in other parts of Southeast Asia. Okay. So it's something that, if we heard about this before we put in the Vietnam strategy, we could have mentioned something about it. But, next time we'll.
I think this relates to our field school back in 2019, Natalie, where part of the issue that we encountered was urban migration among the rural populations. And then, what happened when they returned to the rural areas. I think, now, the strategy we encountered in Vietnam did not mention this, but I think it is an important aspect that might have been overlooked. Obviously, and that's a normal process, as any country industrializes, the differentials in the wage between rural areas and the industrial zone, that's going to be pushing rural population out of rural areas, and that's unavoidable. The question is then, what can government design policy in a way to attract that, or at least even out the wage differential between rural areas and urban areas, so that at least the migration wave are more managed in a way. It's not like tidal wave; it's more like more even here. So I think that's probably how I would answer that.
Okay, We are coming up against the top of the hour, so I'm really sorry to those of you who posed great questions, which we haven't had time to get to. I really do apologise. I did want to come to some of those, but we have run out of time, and we do like to stick to time here at ACIAR. So we're going to wrap it up now. I would like to thank you, Tiho, for your presentation, and Chi for your contribution as well. It was really wonderful to have such focus on agriculture and strategic planning as part of this special webinar series. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you all, and apologies for the questions, but we can touch on some of those separately or in another occasion.
Wonderful. And if you are interested in joining us next week, we have a wonderful presentation to look forward to by Dr. Russell Toth, who's going to be looking at financial innovation and how it improves access to finance in Myanmar. So another great webinar to look out for. Please join us same time next week. Until then, stay dry, stay safe, and thanks once again for joining us.